America has always struggled with the same quiet suspicion that the rules don't land the same way for everyone. That somewhere above the rest of us, there's a different floor of the system where consequences soften, doors open, and problems disappear. People see it every day: powerful men walking away, money smoothing edges, silence purchased where truth should live. And after a while, that suspicion hardens into belief that some people are simply untouchable. Jeffrey Epstein carried himself like a man who believed exactly that. Not because of anything he said out loud, but because of how he moved through the world. Private jets waiting on runways. Elite attorneys who spoke before anyone else could finish a sentence. The quiet confidence of someone who had been questioned before, and had always left the room unchanged. No panic. No urgency. Just the assumption that this, like everything else, would pass. That assumption followed him into the courtroom. There was nothing grand about the room itself. No flashing cameras. No dramatic entrances. Just polished wood, muted voices, and the steady rhythm of a system doing what it does every day. It was the kind of place where excuses usually don't survive long, and where status means less than truth. Sitting at the bench was Judge Frank Caprio, known not for spectacle, but for something far more dangerous to arrogance: patience. He listens. He lets people talk themselves into revealing who they really are. And when the moment comes, he doesn't bend. That contrast, between a man who believed the rules could never touch him and a judge who believed the rules must apply to everyone, is where this story begins. Because what happened next didn't just challenge Epstein's confidence. It challenged a belief millions of Americans quietly carry. If you've ever felt the system works differently for the powerful, you might want to stay with this. And if you believe no one should be above the law, go ahead and hit like now, because this case is about to test that belief in a way few ever do. The courtroom moved at a steady, almost reassuring pace that morning. One case ended, another began, and each person who stepped forward carried a different version of the same quiet anxiety. A single mother explained why she missed a payment after her hours were cut. A veteran spoke softly about a citation he didn't understand, his hands folded tightly as if still trained to stay composed under pressure. A construction worker admitted fault without excuses, only asking to be treated fairly. None of them were powerful. None of them were untouchable. And yet every one of them was heard. At the center of it all sat Judge Frank Caprio, calm and unhurried, listening in a way that made people forget they were standing in a courtroom. He didn't rush answers. He didn't interrupt with lectures. He asked questions instead, simple ones, meant to understand the person rather than the paperwork. When he ruled, he explained why. Not in legal jargon, but in plain language, the kind that made people nod even when the decision didn't go their way. For a young father juggling two jobs, that meant a reduced fine and a clear warning about what would happen next time. For a veteran struggling to navigate civilian rules, it meant patience paired with responsibility. Caprio made it clear that mistakes mattered, but so did circumstances. Accountability was not about humiliation. It was about correction. About making sure the lesson landed without breaking the person receiving it. That balance defined the room. This was not a place where punishment was handed out for applause or spectacle. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches designed for an audience. The authority in the courtroom didn't come from force, it came from consistency. People trusted that if they told the truth, it would count for something. And more often than not, it did. Caprio's reputation had been built on moments like these. He was known for second chances but never free passes. He believed that the law existed to guide people back on track, not to crush them under its weight. Yet even as he showed compassion, there was always a line, one he never allowed anyone to cross. The rules mattered. Responsibility mattered. And excuses, no matter how polished, only worked if they were honest. Observers in the room could feel it. This courtroom didn't belong to the loudest voice or the best-dressed lawyer. It belonged to the process. To the idea that justice, when handled correctly, didn't need theatrics to be effective. Every ruling reinforced the same message. You will be treated with dignity here, but you will also be held accountable for your choices. That was the baseline. That was the standard everyone else that day was measured against. And it mattered, because it made what was coming next impossible to misunderstand. When someone walked into this courtroom expecting special treatment, it wasn't because the court invited that expectation. It was because they misunderstood the nature of the room entirely. As the docket moved forward, the mood remained steady, almost predictable. Compassion where it was earned. Firmness where it was necessary. No favoritism. No shortcuts. And beneath that calm rhythm sat an unspoken truth that regulars in the room already knew. Empathy here was a strength, not a weakness. Listening was not the same as yielding. Because while Judge Caprio believed deeply in mercy, he believed just as deeply in the principle that mercy must be deserved. And when that principle was challenged, when someone mistook kindness for softness, the courtroom had a way of reminding them where the real authority stood. That reminder was coming. When the courtroom clerk called the next case, the shift in energy was immediate, though almost imperceptible. The door opened and Jeffrey Epstein stepped inside with a calm smile that didn't belong to the room. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't defensive. It was the expression of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided somewhere else. He wasn't alone. A line of sharply dressed attorneys followed, moving with practiced coordination, folders tucked neatly under their arms. Everything about them suggested preparation without urgency. Papers were already organized. Notes already marked. This wasn't their first time here, and they behaved as if it wouldn't matter much if it were their last. To them, this hearing looked like a formality waiting to be cleared. Epstein's body language told the same story. He stood relaxed, shoulders loose, posture unguarded. There was no visible concern, no flicker of doubt. He glanced around the courtroom the way someone might scan a waiting room, as if checking how long they'd be inconvenienced. The confidence wasn't loud. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. The kind that comes from walking away unscathed too many times to count. As his legal team approached the bench, one of them spoke first, voice measured and polite, as though setting the tone for an easy conversation. There were references to documents already submitted, to understandings previously reached, to matters that had been addressed elsewhere. The words were careful. Nothing explicit. Nothing that could be quoted out of context. Just enough to suggest that this case existed within a larger, unspoken framework. It was subtle intimidation, the kind that doesn't threaten outright but implies familiarity with the system's hidden levers. A mention of prior arrangements. A reminder of how things had been handled before. The suggestion that continuing further might be unnecessary. The implication hung in the air: this doesn't need to go the long way. Epstein himself remained silent, letting his attorneys do the talking. He watched the bench with mild interest, almost detached, as if this exchange were unfolding exactly as expected. His assumption was clear. The hearing would be brief. The paperwork would speak for itself. He would leave the same way he arrived, unchanged. At the bench, Judge Frank Caprio didn't interrupt. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't signal agreement or resistance. He simply listened. His expression stayed neutral, unreadable, giving nothing away. To someone used to pushing boundaries, that silence could be mistaken for compliance. The lawyers continued, leaning gently on precedent, on convenience, on the idea that discretion was in everyone's best interest. They spoke as if this courtroom operated like others they'd visited before, places where status shortened conversations and influence smoothed outcomes. Each sentence assumed cooperation. Each pause assumed consent. Epstein shifted his weight slightly, still relaxed. No tension crept into his posture. He didn't need to speak. In his mind there was nothing to correct. This was how things went. This was how they always went. But something in the room had changed. The same spectators who had watched Judge Caprio handle earlier cases with patience now felt the contrast sharpening. This wasn't a single parent asking for understanding. This wasn't a veteran seeking clarity. This was a man arriving with expectations, not explanations. With confidence, not accountability. And the difference was impossible to ignore. Caprio remained quiet, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. Not for the lawyers, they were used to silence, but for the assumption behind their words. He looked down at the documents, then back up at the defense table. Still no reaction. Still no shortcut offered. That was Epstein's first real mistake. By treating the hearing as a formality, he revealed his mindset. By assuming a quiet exit, he exposed his belief that the rules were flexible, at least for people like him. And by letting influence do the talking, he underestimated the one thing this courtroom had already made clear that morning. Fairness here was not for sale. As the silence lingered, a realization began to creep in. Not yet panic, but confusion. This wasn't moving as quickly as expected. The familiar rhythm wasn't there. The nod of acknowledgement hadn't come. The path out of the room hadn't opened. From the outside it still looked calm. But beneath that calm, something fundamental had shifted. What Epstein believed was routine was about to become something else entirely. And for the first time, the confidence that had carried him through so many rooms felt just a little less certain. The pause stretched longer than Epstein expected. What had begun as mild inconvenience now edged into irritation. He shifted slightly at the defense table, his expression tightening just enough to notice if you were looking for it. This wasn't how these moments usually unfolded. Silence was supposed to signal agreement, not resistance. One of his attorneys glanced back at him, then forward again, recalibrating. The tone changed, not abruptly but deliberately. Polite firmness replaced procedural courtesy. The suggestion was no longer implied, it was gently pressed. There were reminders of efficiency, of time, of how extended proceedings helped no one. Words like discretion and resolution floated into the air, framed as reasonable, even responsible. The message underneath them was unmistakable. Continuing this case publicly would be unnecessary, complicated, uncomfortable for everyone involved. Epstein leaned forward just slightly, elbows resting casually on the table. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, measured, almost conversational. No threat. No anger. Just certainty. "Let's be realistic, Your Honor." The words landed harder than he intended. The courtroom froze. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Even the faint rustle of paper seemed too loud. It was the kind of phrase that revealed more than it concealed, a quiet assertion that reality as Epstein understood it came with different rules. That realism meant recognizing influence, recognizing limits, recognizing when to stop asking questions. At the bench, Judge Frank Caprio didn't react immediately. He didn't raise his voice or shift his posture. He simply looked up, meeting Epstein's gaze without expression. The calm in the room didn't break, but it sharpened. Caprio responded slowly, deliberately, each word placed with care. He acknowledged the desire for efficiency, then dismissed it just as carefully. This courtroom, he explained, was not governed by convenience. It was governed by process. And process required transparency, not shortcuts. He rejected the suggestion outright. No quiet resolution. No abbreviated path forward. The case would proceed fully on the record with every relevant detail examined. Not because it was sensational, but because that was the obligation of the court. There was no accusation in his tone. No reprimand. Just clarity. For the first time since he entered the room, Epstein's confidence wavered. It wasn't dramatic. There was no visible panic. But something subtle changed. His relaxed posture tightened. His gaze flickered just briefly toward his attorneys. The easy assumption that had carried him this far faltered. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. The lawyers attempted to regain control, adjusting their approach, but the momentum had shifted. Caprio continued calmly, outlining the steps that would follow. Evidence would be reviewed. Statements would be heard. The case would not be rushed. And it would not be shielded. The courtroom felt different now. The earlier calm had transformed into focused tension. Everyone present understood that a boundary had been crossed, not by the judge but by the assumption that the judge would yield. Epstein leaned back again, trying to recover his composure, but the ease was gone. The room no longer felt like a waiting area. It felt like a courtroom again. A place where words mattered. Where influence didn't substitute for accountability. Caprio finished by reminding everyone that respect for the court went both ways. He offered fairness, not favors. And he expected the same seriousness from anyone who stood before him, regardless of who they were outside those walls. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Epstein nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a reality he hadn't planned for. The realization settled in quietly. This would not be a brief appearance. This would not end quietly. And whatever leverage he believed he carried into the room had just lost its power. The line had been crossed. And there was no stepping back over it. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice or signal a dramatic turn. He simply opened the file in front of him and began where the law always begins. Patterns. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Records. Dates. Prior complaints that had been noted, deferred, revisited, and in some cases quietly redirected elsewhere. One incident alone could be explained away. Two could be minimized. But a pattern, once laid out carefully, had a way of stripping excuses down to nothing. He moved through the history slowly, methodically, allowing each detail to settle before moving to the next. Inconsistencies emerged, not in accusations but in explanations. Statements that didn't align with timelines. Claims that shifted depending on who was asking. Prior assurances that something had been resolved, yet somehow kept returning under different circumstances. The paperwork told a story that confidence never could. At the defense table, the atmosphere changed. Lawyers who had entered the room composed now leaned closer together, whispering, flipping pages back and forth. When asked to clarify, their answers stretched longer and landed softer. They spoke of misunderstandings, of context, of interpretations. But each attempt to smooth over the record only highlighted how uneven it was. Caprio didn't argue with them. He didn't accuse. He let the contradictions speak for themselves. When one explanation conflicted with another, he paused. When a timeline didn't line up, he asked a single follow-up question and waited. The courtroom felt the weight of it, the quiet pressure of truth asserting itself without force. Then the shift came. The judge closed the file gently and looked up. He explained calmly that the court would now hear from those affected. Not to inflame emotion. Not to sensationalize. But because the law demanded more than procedural correctness. It demanded acknowledgement of impact. The first statement was delivered without drama. The voice was steady, controlled, almost restrained. There were no raised voices, no pleas for sympathy. Just facts spoken plainly with dignity. The kind of testimony that didn't ask to be believed because it didn't need to. The room grew still, not from shock, but from recognition. As more voices followed, the tone of the courtroom transformed. What had once centered on status, influence, and expectation now centered on consequence. On how actions ripple outward. On the cost that doesn't show up in legal filings or polished arguments. Each statement added weight, not emotional excess but human reality. Epstein was no longer the focus of attention. He sat there, present but diminished, as the gravity of what had been discussed settled over the room. The confidence that once framed the proceeding felt irrelevant now. The narrative had moved beyond him. It belonged to the harm, not the man who believed he could outpace it. Caprio listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush. When one speaker paused to steady themselves, he waited. When another finished, he acknowledged them with the same respect he'd shown to everyone else that day. The message was unmistakable. This was not about spectacle. It was about accountability meeting reality. The courtroom, once tense with procedural maneuvering, now held a different kind of silence. Heavier. More honest. The kind that settles in when everyone understands that something important has shifted, and there's no going back to how it was before. And this is the moment where people usually look away. Don't. Stories like this only matter if people pay attention, and if you're still watching right now, you're exactly why accountability still exists. Stay with me. Caprio finally spoke again, his tone unchanged but the meaning sharper. He reminded the court that influence can delay reckoning, but it cannot erase impact. That records can be managed but patterns remain. And that the law, when applied correctly, does not ask who someone is, it asks what they did and who was affected. The defense had no polished response left. What remained were fragments, technical points that no longer addressed the heart of the matter. The balance of the room had shifted completely. The question was no longer whether this case should continue. It was how the truth, now fully in the open, would be answered. By the time the judge returned to the bench notes, everyone understood the same thing. Whatever outcome followed would not be shaped by power or expectation. It would be shaped by evidence, by impact, and by a courtroom that had refused to look away. Judge Caprio waited until the room was fully settled before he spoke. Not because he needed attention, but because what he was about to say didn't need volume to carry weight. His voice was steady, measured, and unmistakably clear. He didn't begin with punishment. He began with principle. He explained that courts exist to protect truth, not comfort. That money, no matter how much of it someone has, cannot buy silence when harm has already been done. Influence, he said, might delay accountability, but it does not erase it. The law is not impressed by power. It is obligated to confront it. He looked directly at Epstein, not with anger, not with judgment, but with finality. This was no longer a negotiation. This was the end of assumptions. Caprio spoke about accountability as something deeper than fines or penalties. Accountability, he explained, is about public responsibility. About standing in the same light as everyone else. About having actions recorded, acknowledged, and answered for, without insulation, without exception. Justice loses its meaning the moment it becomes selective. There were no theatrics in his delivery. No dramatic pauses meant for cameras. Just a careful dismantling of the idea that status changes obligation. He rejected the notion that discretion should protect reputation when transparency was required to protect the public. Silence, he made clear, serves power, not justice. Then he delivered the sentence. It was precise, grounded, unavoidable. Every consequence would be on the public record. No sealed outcomes. No quiet resolutions. No special accommodations. The ruling ensured that accountability would not end when the courtroom doors closed. Oversight would follow. Documentation would remain. The process would continue exactly as it would for anyone else. Caprio made it clear that the court would not reduce consequences simply because the defendant had resources to absorb them. Punishment was not calibrated to comfort. It was calibrated to responsibility. And responsibility, once established, does not disappear behind influence. Then came the line, the one that would echo far beyond the room. In this courtroom, he said, the law does not ask who you are. It asks what you did. And when power meets consequence, it's consequence that must prevail. The words landed without force, yet they carried it. A statement so simple it couldn't be argued with. So direct it left no space for reinterpretation. Epstein didn't respond. He didn't protest. He didn't look to his attorneys. He sat still, absorbing the reality that had finally caught up to him. Whatever confidence he'd brought into the room had no use here anymore. There was no redemption offered, because redemption was never the court's role. Exposure was. Caprio concluded by reminding everyone present that justice does not seek revenge. It seeks balance. And balance, once restored, does not favor the powerful or the powerless. It favors the truth. The court, he said, had done its duty. Not by making an example, but by refusing to make an exception. As the ruling was finalized, the room remained silent. No reactions. No murmurs. Just the weight of accountability settling where it belonged. Epstein stood to leave, no longer the center of gravity he'd once assumed himself to be. He walked out not redeemed, not forgiven, but exposed. The myth of untouchable power had been stripped down to what it always was. A belief sustained only until someone refused to bend. And in that courtroom, bending had never been an option. The impact of the ruling didn't announce itself with noise. It spread quietly, the way truth often does when it finally reaches the surface. Outside the courtroom, conversations changed. People who had long believed that power-insulated consequence felt something unfamiliar, confirmation. Not outrage. Not celebration. Just the steady reassurance that the system, when pressed, could still hold its ground. Public awareness followed naturally. Not driven by spectacle, but by clarity. The case didn't restore faith in every institution or erase years of skepticism, but it did something rarer. It reminded people why the law exists in the first place. For a brief moment, the distance between ordinary citizens and the courtroom felt smaller. More human. More reachable. Inside that same courthouse, the next day looked almost identical to the one before. The benches filled again with people carrying ordinary problems. A working mother worried about a citation she couldn't afford. A veteran confused by a notice he didn't understand. A young man admitting fault, hoping responsibility might earn him a second chance. The rhythm resumed without ceremony. Judge Caprio returned to the bench the same way he always did. Same calm posture. Same patient listening. Same steady explanations. There was no shift in tone, no trace of self-importance. He didn't reference the case. He didn't linger on its significance. To him, it had never been about who stood before him, it had been about how the law was applied. And that consistency was the point. Justice, when it works, isn't loud. It doesn't demand applause. It doesn't rely on dramatic moments to prove itself. It shows up the same way, day after day, applying the same standards whether the person standing at the table is struggling to get by or accustomed to being shielded. It listens. It weighs. It decides. And then it moves on. That is how trust is built, not through rare victories but through repetition. Through knowing that the rules won't change based on status. Through watching accountability arrive without spectacle, and mercy appear without weakness. In that courtroom, fairness wasn't something turned on for special cases. It was the baseline. The ripple effect lasted just long enough to remind people of something essential. The law is not self-sustaining. It doesn't enforce itself. It only works when it is demanded, by judges willing to stand firm, and by citizens willing to pay attention. Silence allows power to grow unchecked. Attention keeps it honest. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Accountability doesn't survive on outrage alone. It survives on consistency, on presence, on people refusing to look away simply because the moment has passed. If you want more stories where power meets accountability, where the courtroom doesn't blink, subscribe. Because justice only stays alive when people keep watching.